And this is chapter 4, your communication and documentation chapter. Preparatory stuff is mostly all the same. We're going to talk about therapeutic communications here. Basically, an important thing is going to be the verbal diffusing strategies. Take a look at communication. You need it for a lot of things. You need to communicate in this job. For one thing, you have a partner and you have a patient. Or you have patient's family, and usually fire department, sometimes PD, and then you need to give a handoff for it. So this communication stuff is really important for team dynamics. Documentation is also very important because they're legal documents, and you report all your findings. And even if the doctor wasn't there to hear your report, he could read your documentation. We've gone over medical terminology there last Wednesday, so be sure and review that and learn it so you can actually understand what's being talked about. Okay, communication is just transfer of information. All right, you can do it one of two ways. You can actually talk verbal, or it can be nonverbal. Nonverbal is usually the stuff that we don't actually understand ourselves that we're doing, but we need to be aware of when we're working with other people. Verbal communication skills are very important. All right, you're communicating with all these team members that you have. It lets you gather the information that you need. Taking a patient history, things like their medication allergies is very important. Actually, knowing what's wrong with the patient is going to be a lot of times verbal, the things they tell you. So it's going to be something like 80% of your information that you get that you actually calculate into what you think is wrong with the patient are going to be the things they tell you. So your documentation, it is part of their permanent medical record. All right. It demonstrates that you actually gave the care that you needed to give. And it helps other people, especially on down the chain in the same sort of medical environment, to actually take care of the patient. So when you complete these patient care records, it actually guarantees the chain of custody of the patient, which is the transfer of responsibility for the patient. You arrived on the scene, you transferred care over to the nurse whenever you got to the hospital. So make sure your records are complete. That way they actually comply with all the requirements of your company, of the insurance company, of HIPAA, of the law enforcement, of the fire department, everything. All right. It fulfills your organization's administrative needs, things like billing so that you can actually stay in business and actually have an ambulance company in the locality. All right, radio equipment. It links EMS to everybody else. So it's other responders that you may need to come on scene. It's a flight crew that you may need to actually dispatch to have a helicopter land. The fire department, you communicate with the law enforcement. The fire department can actually give you information on the patient before you even arrive. So you have to know what your system can and can't do and how your system works. That way you can actually use it efficiently, be effective in all your communication. All right, therapeutic communication. This is both verbal and nonverbal. Things that are nonverbal are things like crossing your arms. It means you're closed off. So you always want to try and actually stand with an open stance so that people can actually intuitively know that you actually care about what you're saying and what they're saying and the treatment that you're actually giving them. It encourages the patients to actually express themselves, which helps you with their care. And it builds a positive relationship, which is pretty much the number one priority in getting trust with the patient so that you can actually render the care that you need to render to actually help this person. The Shannon-Weaver model, it's basically in all textbooks. It's about sending and receiving information and the sorts of noise and traffic that you can actually get. So it's basically the sender actually has a thought, and they actually encode it into a message. So that's verbalizing the actual message that they're thinking. And then they give it to the receiver who decodes their message and actually sends feedback to the sender. The feedback part is actually pretty important because you may decode a message that they did not intend to actually portray to you. So actually talking back and repeating things that they've said to you is an important part of actually having open-ended communication with your patients. So you actually repeat things a whole lot to patients to make sure that you heard the information correctly. Things you need to consider with patients: age, sex, religious, cultural backgrounds, their education, all right, their voice volume, your voice volume, All right. What kind of facial expressions you're making, that sort of stuff. So you need to understand all this stuff when you're actually talking to people and take in all this information yourself so that you can actually understand what they're trying to communicate. So all these things influence how a person communicates. It may be different than how you communicate, but as you interact more with more cultures and more different types of people, socioeconomic strata, that sort of thing, your communication can differ and you can understand people better. All right. So in some cultures, expressing emotion is called a weakness, and maybe some sort of, usually it's a sort of macho culture is how you might colloquially refer to it. But in other cultures, it's impolite to actually look away while speaking. In some cultures, it's impolite to make direct eye contact for long periods of time while talking. So you just have to learn these things. Your tone, pace, and volume language is important. It's important not to yell. Use your inside voice for most of the time, unless there's loud equipment out, that sort of thing. It reflects your mood to the patient. If you come in with a calm, professional demeanor, they're going to pick up on it, and you're going to get a lot more valuable information by doing that because they're going to trust you. So ethnocentrism, that's basically staying within your own cultural values and making those more important than the cultural values of others. That's going to really hamper you in making good relationships with your patient because you're going to meet all sorts of different people, as far as the patients, their family, even your coworkers. Right? So you try not to impose your culture on people. So don't force those values on people. If it's impolite to stare at someone, you don't force them to stare at you. That sort of stuff. Nonverbal communication, body language. It gives more information for people, even though you're not saying things. You might be trying to communicate a message just with how you're standing. All right. So even though you don't actually exchange words with people, it tells them your mood. It tells them you're frustrated with this call because you've run 5 of the same calls, but each patient contact is unique and different. So watch your facial expressions and your body language. All these things communicate a message to people. All right, when treating a hostile patient, be aware of your own body and your body language. All right, stay calm. All right, keep the situation calm. Use a soothing tone, that sort of stuff. There's a lot of art to this, and you're going to learn a lot as you interact with different kinds of people. The ways you can actually talk to people. For instance, if you're interacting with someone who has just been in a fight, all right, at a bar, and he's a big tough guy, all right, me talking to that patient in a loud tone of voice is usually not going to work. However, a lot of these people had, the only influence in their life is their mother. So if I have a partner that's female that actually raises their voice at them, they tend to quiet up and listen. So you have to know what you can and can't do with these people, but always stay calm and always try and diffuse a potential situation that's going to get out of control. All right, it's important. Always assess the scene safety. Always be safe. And don't assume an aggressive posture. Don't swear up to people. All right? Always make good eye contact. Don't stare at people. Make sure they know that you're actually looking. Look for their injuries. Look for their signs and symptoms. Speak calmly. Be confident. That way they know and have confidence in you. If they think you're confident in what you're doing, they're going to just kind of transfer that confidence. All right? And speak slowly, but don't ever threaten people verbally or physically. That's very big. Okay. Noise or sounds in the environment can be distracting. Okay. It can affect your communication. All right. Cultural norms also affect your communication by things like, especially nonverbal communications. How much space you need to give the patient. Americans are very, have that bubble around them. They like to keep that 3 feet of space between people. A lot of other cultures have that same sort of thing. But know that when we're in the ambulance, there's not a whole lot of space available. Right? So you can apologize to people for that and explain that to them. All right, but watch your gestures and body movement. Your attitudes are very important. You're going to have to talk to patients, so you can't just clam up. All right, so you're going to have to talk to them about all sorts of things. It's helpful when you talk to patients that you have a wide base of knowledge in all sorts of things. All right. So if you don't, once you start working, it can be helpful to do things like study other cultures. All right. Study Spanish if you don't speak it. If you speak Spanish already, that's awesome. It's going to help you out a lot in your career, but also other things that you may not think can come into play. Studying things like art and photography, I find that usually helps with things like patients who are adolescent females who like attempted suicide. They're usually creative people for some reason, and I work in a rural setting so we can have some long transport times. All right. And they want to talk. It can help build trust with patients. I've talked about things like the 1960s Kansas City Chiefs with elderly patients when we had long transports. It just builds trust, and it makes them more likely to actually talk to you and communicate. Right? So whenever possible, use open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are things that don't have a binary answer. It's a question that's not a yes or no. It's a thing where they can describe things. So, you can come in and say, what seems to be bothering you today? What's going on? All right. They say they're hurting. All right. Well, describe what it feels like for me. Because you're the one experiencing this pain. Describe what it feels like. That way it's not a yes or no thing. All right. Yes or no answers tend to lead your patients down roads of which they may not have considered before. And it kind of puts ideas in their head, which is why we don't use a lot of yes or no if we can avoid it. Closed-ended questions are short responses. Like I said, it's usually binary. Yes or no. It's one thing or the other. All right. Response is a single word. All right. If they can't provide long answers with things like, if they're having difficulty breathing, closed-ended questions are usually better to ask because it makes them not have to use like speaking complete sentences. So these people may speak in sentences that are only like 2 or 3 words long before they have to take a long pause and take breaths in, that sort of thing. Communication tools, they're all here. And like I said, one of the best things you can do is actually reflect back to people and tell them what they told you. All right. So show empathy is a good communication tool. Explaining what you're doing is awesome. Trying to interpret what they're telling you or interpret things where you're not using medical jargon is important. All right. So make sure you clarify all your statements. You can summarize your statements at the end. All these things are very useful. On the picture here, using touch conveys a lot of caring. A lot of times, most of the people that like for you to hold their hands are going to be like elderly females, which is fine, and it really helps build a rapport between you and them. All right, you can use touch so long as you get permission. All right, don't just do it just out of the blue. All right, but it does show care and compassion. So use sparingly but conscientiously. Okay, avoid touching torso, chest, face. Like in the picture of this, the CMT has the hand on the shoulder. Hand on the arm there. It just shows people that you care. Things you need to avoid: don't give false assurances. All right, it will come back to bite you. All right, don't give advice that's unsolicited. All right, you can tell them these sorts of things that they're doing are going to lead to these sorts of medical problems. All right, but life advice, this is not the time. You don't need to talk too much. What that basically means is you need to give the patient time to answer the questions. Don't use why questions. If someone has attempted suicide, you don't need to ask them why they did it. A lot of times they're going to volunteer that information anyway. All right, so you don't need to use authoritarian language. So authoritative language is usually how they express it here, or speaking jargon. All right, you can be on the same level as the patient, and they're still going to know that you're going to be in charge of the situation because you're calm and professional. All right, family and bystanders, they can actually be very valuable, especially if, it's something like they're taking care of an elderly patient or it's the parent of a minor. Somebody that's a patient that can't actually talk to you, the people around there, whatever they know, it's important to find out. All right. But always allow the patient to answer the question, even if family member's there. What can usually happen is they can start answering for people because they're trying to help in the situation because they don't know what to do. So what you can do in those sorts of situations, you have a firefighter or, your partner say, hey, can you take this person and have them show you where the patient's medication is, and then you can write them down. That way it gets that person out of the room and you can talk to the patient. Those sorts of techniques where you kind kind of separate people that are interjecting where they don't have to, just because they're concerned for the patient or helpful. But don't be afraid to ask others to step aside. All right. So be sure make eye contact when you're talking to someone and ask them questions. Although you can ask questions when you're doing an assessment so they know you're doing something. All right, that's fine. Provide your name. Always ask for the patient's name. All right, and use the proper name that they actually give you. All right, you can use Mr. and Mrs. For elderly patients. That's usually going to be the rigor here. But always tell the patient the truth. All right, use language the patient can understand. You don't talk to a pediatric patient in the same way as you talk to a 30-year-old adult patient. That's going to be obvious. All right, but so don't demean people. Don't use language you would use with a child, with an elderly patient. That's not what they want. All right, it's not going to be the thing that's going to give you the best results. It's not going to build that rapport with the patient. Be careful about what you say about the patient to others, even if they're the power of attorney and that sort of thing. And like I said, always be aware of your body language. Speak slowly. Make sure they can understand you and what you're saying. If they have a quizzical look, you probably use medical jargon or a word they didn't understand. Right. The patient's hard of hearing. It's helpful if you actually look at a patient and they can read your lips. It's harder to do now that we have COVID and wearing these masks all the time. But try your best. Allow the patient time to answer and respond. Don't ask the question and then while they're answering, think of the next question you're going to ask. All right. Healthcare providers do that all the time. But always act and speak in a calm, confident manner. All right. Even if it's an emergency situation, make sure they have time to respond in the way that they want to respond, because that's going to give you the sort of information that you need, not a canned answer that you can just write in a report. It's going to be the information you need that they actually give you. Emotional intelligence, especially people that have, mental handicaps and mental disabilities, things like that. This can include people that say they've had a motorcycle accident, so they've had a brain injury before. All right, you might have to speak slowly to these people if they can understand you, things like that. But the ability to understand and manage your emotion properly is going to help the patient manage theirs. If you're calm, it can help them calm down. And they may still not be calm, but they'll be calmer than if you're excited. All right. It diffuses conflict. All right. It builds that rapport that you're going to need, but it's effective communication. All right. So you can manage the difficult situations just by your voice most of the time. So emotional intelligence, has a lot of things about it. It's self-awareness, that sort of thing. You ought to be self-aware as an EMT. So at the end of this 8 weeks, we're going to have you just fill out a report about what you think your problems are and what you think you're good at. All right, it's just a simple piece of paper here, but that's part of self-awareness, and you really need that. That way you can spot your flaws and correct them before they become a problem, before your partner actually has to, tell you about what your problems are and what bugs them. All right. Emotional intelligence implies empathy, your social skills, the motivations for why you're doing what you're doing. All right. Improving your emotional intelligence. All right. Assess how you react to a stressful situation, and you can start that in labs when we start these patient like scenarios after we teach you the basic kind of skills, and you can see how you respond to these stressful situations, because we have to actually put you under a little bit of stress as best we can, not much, when we're in the lab situation, in a situation where basically everybody fails. Everybody that's teaching these classes, the lab assistants, the director of the EMS program, Miss Reynolds, we all failed in scenarios. We do it all the time. The scenarios aren't set out to make you fail, but you will, because you're just learning, and that's okay. So make sure you practice your mindfulness. Make sure you focus and pay attention, all right, while taking in all the information you can. But take responsibility for the action that you've done. Is very important, and then try and correct that action if it was wrong. All right, and then consider how those actions affect others around. All right, this behavioral stairway model, it's for crisis management. All right, so active listening, which includes things like repeating things back, displaying empathy. All right, but it helps you assert your influence. So this is real helpful when a patient is iffy on going to the hospital with half more time than what you would think. So this kind of thing helps you out. Again, you can see in this picture compassion, because they're actually, communicating with some touch here. Right? Always identify yourself. Present yourself as confident and professional. All right? Don't assume that all the patients that see now are confused. All right? Make sure that you treat them as if they're confident, even if they're senile. All right? Even if they have dementia, make sure that you treat them with respect. All right? They're still a human being. And if they're older, or if they're homeless, or if they're some group of people, I don't know, that maybe you wouldn't like, you got to put that aside when you're on the job. All right? Everybody's equal. So you can, when you're interacting with older people, you can have some hostility. All right? They spent, 80 years of their life taking care of themselves. All right. And now they have to call for an ambulance to take care of them. All right. It could be something that can be emotionally devastating to some people, especially because they think, if I go to the hospital, they may try and force me into a nursing home, when that's totally not the case. All right. Even if they don't express that to you. So be professional and tell them, hey, we'll take you to the hospital. The doctor will evaluate you, and then they'll decide when you can actually return home. I can't tell you when that's going to be, but the doctor will let you know. But if someone is older and they're irrational and they're hostile, don't think that's just normal. Okay? Think that there might be something wrong with it, because there are medical conditions that influence mental capacity. All right? Always approach people slowly and calmly, but confidently. All right? Don't look like you're there to hurt somebody, obviously, but allow plenty of time for the patient to respond to your questions. All right? If it's a situation where it's not life-threatening right now, all right, it's always best to stay as long as necessary on the scene for them to answer all the questions you need, to get all the information that you need, all the vital signs, do a complete assessment, all that. All right. Watch for signs of confusion or anxiety. You're going to know this. All right. You can see anxiety just in facial expressions. All right. You can see confusion in facial expressions. It might even be things like when they look away after you ask questions. All right. So things like that. Be patient with them. All right. The patient should feel confident that you're in charge, but that doesn't mean you have to be bossy. All right. Just make sure that they know that everything that can be done is being done for them. Older patients are a little different physiologically. They might not feel as much pain. Their sensory nerves aren't as good as when they were younger, which is why even in warm weather they might be wearing a sweater, because they don't regulate their body temperature as well. They don't feel pain as well. All right. They may not be aware of changes in their body systems. So they might not be aware of things like they don't have as much thirst response as you do. So you're going to get thirsty a lot more than an elderly patient will. So they're going to be dehydrated a lot and not even know it. Things like that. Be vigilant for objective changes in when possible. Always give time to a patient to actually bring whatever they want to the hospital. All right. It doesn't have to be crazy. All right. But if they want to bring a change of clothes and look for their cell phone and their cell phone charger, that thing is okay. All right. Things like hearing aids and dentures. Hearing aids are very expensive right now. Dentures are expensive. They may need the glasses to read something while they're in the hospital. They may need it just to see. All right. So it's okay if they're not in a life-threatening situation that you do that. And even if they are, if you have time to send maybe one of the firefighters to go look for it before you leave, try and do that. All right. Older patients are often worried about the valuables in their home. They've spent a lifetime actually collecting this stuff. And then someone has to take care of their pet. Well, if they have to stay in the hospital for 5 days, who's going to take care of their pet? That sort of stuff. Make sure you lock the door and ask them, hey, do you have your keys? You want me to lock the door here? And they'll let you know. All right, with children, they're often very afraid. One of the things you can do with children, if they're not in a real life-threatening situation, and you'll learn what these situations are, is if you talk to their parents and remain calm, and you see their parent actually talking to you, that actually builds trust with the pediatric patient, because they know you're somebody that can trust, because their parent can trust you, right? But they could be frightened by you in your uniform. All right, they may have had something happen to them in the past that's traumatic that can actually affect them. So, if they were in a house fire before and they were badly burned, and they had to be transported to the hospital by ambulance. To be fearful of EMTs is kind of natural, okay, because they've had these experiences before. But they can be scared by the bright lights and that sort of stuff, and the whole bunch of people that are around them, and just social changes. All right, they can keep their toys or a security blanket and stuff like that. That's just fine with me. If they're alert enough to ask for it, right, and you can take the time, you can have someone go get it. All right, if they have a family member nearby that can ride in the back with them, because there are seatbelts in the back of the ambulance that they'll need to wear, that's okay. All right, we're all going to be close anyway. That's fine. If you can, the parent or guardian, whoever the patient trusts, can hold them while you're doing the evaluation and treatment. It's not a good idea to do it during transport. Sometimes it's necessary. Consult your protocols and that stuff. Always be honest with them. If you lie to a kid, they'll never trust you again. All right, so tell them ahead of time if something is going to hurt. All right, so be honest about that stuff. Make sure you understand. You tell them that it's necessary, and you discuss it with the parent or the guardian that's there with them, and then they can help reinforce telling the child that it's necessary. You have to do this, but always respect the child's modesty. You don't have, if you don't have to remove clothing, you don't, even on a normal patient, don't do it. Always tell them what you have to do. There's things like if there's a child that's been sexually abused in the past and they know about this. They can be especially fearful of this, but they might let mom take off their shirt, for instance, if you had to do it. So if there's things like pediatric seizures, which are caused by high fevers, and there's a patient that's pediatric that's been sexually abused in the past, they might not want you to remove their clothing, but you have to, because you have to keep them cool, or else they can have another seizure. So you might have mom do that for you, and then they're going to be more comfortable with that happening. All right. So, speaking of professional friendly way, all right, you don't have to talk to a 13-year-old like a 5-year-old, obviously, but you can maintain contact, and it's helpful often to position yourself at the child's level. So it's, taking a knee, that sort of stuff, and actually looking at them like eye to eye, it helps them a lot. So hearing impaired patients, it can be helpful to just get some normal sign language that you can use with a lot of patients. Words like help are important. I think it actually shows you that in the book. Usually when I make the help sign, I actually do it because it's kind of like a fist over an open palm and raising it up. That helps them know. Sometimes they can read your lips, sometimes they can't. It depends. All right. With hearing aids, they can bring those. If you have to shout, you shout, and always tell the receiving staff if somebody's hearing impaired so they know. All right. But if they're not hearing impaired and they're elderly, obviously don't shout at them. They can understand you just fine. But position yourself so they can see you. Ask the family if they have hearing aids, that sort of stuff. They'll usually tell you what sort of disability someone has or handicap, whatever the case may be. So if they're hard of hearing, you're usually going to have a pen and paper ready. There's usually, because you use monitors, there's always paper. You should always carry a pen with you. Just a normal ballpoint. I would stress not to use like a gel pen, because sometimes you might want to write something on your glove, which happens sometimes, and those gel pens are just going to smear. So use like the cheap big pens whenever you're at work. If the patient can read the lip, speak slowly and distinctly. Never shout. Because they're deaf. If they're deaf, they can't hear you if you shout, and you're using your normal tone of voice anyway. But always make a sound. Even if you're using sign language, yeah, like I said here, the sign for help here, usually I'll raise the hand up. Usually I think that's normal. Sick and hurt. So if you look, you kind of got to look carefully with sign language. On A for sick, it's your middle finger there that you're using. So that's the only finger that's touching. Hurt, I'll usually twist my fingers there. And then help, like I said, I'll raise stuff. Another important one, maybe that you want to actually learn, is the sign for drunk. Okay, that way you can actually communicate with your partner without the patient knowing what you're doing. Okay, if they're vision impaired, ask if they can see at all. All right, you can help them walk and things like that. That's going to be important. Even just small distances, because they're not used to you putting the stretcher in their way, they kind of know the way around where they're living. But expect the patient to have normal intelligence, obviously. Explain what you're doing all the time, because you're going to be touching these people and they can't see you before you do it. But stay in physical contact, like a hand on the shoulder, as you begin your patient care, and you're talking to the patient so they know basically that you're there to help them. So when you actually help people that are vision impaired to walk, it's usually going to be they're going to take their hand and put it on your arm. It's not the other way around, like you're dragging them. All right, so it's going to be they're going to put their arm on yours. All right, if they can walk, place their arm on your arm, not the other way around. Transport whatever mobility aids are needed, including a cane. This is true even if there's somebody that uses a walker. It's important that you transport that with them, because they're going to need it whenever their family or friend come and pick them up from the hospital just to get into the car. Guide dogs, you can bring these to the hospital. All right. If someone needs a guide dog, they can come to the hospital. That's fine. If it's just their dog from home, they can't come. All right. So they're going to need something like a vest or something like that. So you can identify them with their harness. So if you look at the, visually impaired person there, they're holding on to a special harness there. If possible, transport it with the patient. All right. It alleviates stress for both. Otherwise, if the patient says it's okay, and they can arrange for care of the animal, arrange for care of their guide dog. For non-English speaking people, you must always find a way to obtain a medical history. Usually there's translator services that you can call into. All right. As if they speak some English, learn some actual Spanish. Do you hurt is easy. All right. Don't move is one that you should learn. Or some mueva. You need to know that one. Point to the parts of the body. Use short sentences, but don't shout. That doesn't help. If they have a family member or a friend interpret, that's awesome. Usually it's going to be like the child who can actually translate for you. Like I said, learn some common phrases. All right, there are pocket cards and simple medical Spanish, like books that you can carry around with you. Usually you can have these on the phone. Google Translate, yeah. I'll always tell the hospital before you arrive that they're, Spanish speaking, or they speak Vietnamese or whatever language, Tagalog, or whatever it is, language that's their first language, if they can't understand English. So, communication with the Russian disruptions will actually make you fail. That is completely true. So the shared mental model. So, it's the picture of an individual has in their head about what's going on. All right. We should all share the same mental model and be on the same page. So you should all know or communicate with each other what your primary focus at the time is. All right. So your primary focus may be airway. All right. That doesn't mean that the whole team has to be on the airway, but that does mean if I have the airway and I'm using the BDN on someone that needs it, but they still have a pulse, your partner can be doing things like checking their oxygen saturation, checking their pulse. All that stuff has to do with the airway as well. What's the history of prior care for this patient? What hospitals have they gone to before? What have they done for the situation in the past? All right. And what's the patient's current state? What do they need immediately? So effective communication is efficient. All right. You always listen to people. It's effective and appropriate. All right. So transfer of that pertinent information is your responsibility. So giving over the handover report. So try and initiate contact. They may tell you to hold on for a second, wait for the doctor or whatever. I don't mind actually giving, one report to the nurse or whatever tech is in there, even though they technically can't get a report. They're part of the patient care team, so they should hear it if they're going to leave before the nurse gets there. That's just my view on the thing. But ensure the ABCs are there. Minimize the noise. Usually what happens is everybody gets quiet so they can actually listen to you. Structure report. Yeah. As far as usually what nurses have, so they're going to be used to that, which is situation background assessment and then recap your treatment. So, it can be 54-year-old male, complains of chest pain. Okay. So he says that he rates it 7 out of scale of 1 to 10. He says it feels crushing. It radiates to his left arm. All right, we gave him aspirin. All right, he took 3 of his own nitro without relief. We provided oxygen. Here are his last vitals. Okay, here's his patient history. He's had, a bypass before. He's had stents before, that sort of thing. All right, going to use SBAT, which is Situation Background Assessment Treatment. All right, so they're basically close to the same. Provide whatever documentation they need, including like medication lists, whatever prior care they had, and what you think their immediate needs are. If you're receiving a handle report, this could be something like if there's an EMR on scene and you show up, or whatever fire department's on scene, and they tell you what's going on, make sure you maintain eye contact. Manage the environment as best you can. All right. Ensure understanding. Summarize back to them what they've said to make sure that you've understood them correctly. And then gather whatever supplementary patient documentation there is. So usually the fire department's going to have whatever information they've collected already. Like there's a carbon copy and things there so they can make a report. All right. So it's going to include things like their medication, or if they just showed up, maybe they just have like their pulse and respiratory rate. That's okay too. Whatever they have, make sure you're respectful. If something, if for some reason there needs to be an interruption, make sure you explain that to them and that you're going to come back and listen to the rest of the report because you care what they have to say. That rarely happens, though. Written communications, PCRs, patient care reports. This is an old term. The term that's used mostly now, because we want to make sure that it's the same between EMS and the hospital, is going to be electronic health record. It's going to be close, but we usually use PCR, patient care reports. It's the pre-hospital care report. It's a legal document. It records everything. All right. Includes things like dispatch time. And you should have done, if you have your work now, you started that sort of documentation in your first exercises there when they gave you a scenario and had you fill out one of these things. So there's two types, written and electronic. Not a lot of people use written anymore. Most people use electronic. But if things like whatever tablet or computer you're using breaks down, you need to have a written backup there ready. It's basically 6 functions here. Continuum of care from you to the hospital. All right. It's a legal document. All right. Administrative information. This is things like of their insurance information, if you can get it. They use that for reimbursement. Okay. Education. This doesn't mean patient's education. It means things like educating the system about what's been going on. Maybe you missed something in your report and it's brought up, that sort of stuff. Data collection. For continuous quality improvement and research. All right. Things like that. So information collected on the PCR. So it's always the patient's chief complaint. It's the dispatch information isn't necessary. The chief complaint is the main complaint that the patient has. All right. So there may be chest pain and difficulty breathing, but their main complaint is going to be difficulty breathing, or maybe both. All right. It's lists on here the mechanism of injury. The mechanism of injury is basically the physical force that you can actually document that caused the patient the injury. So think of things like car wrecks. Was there like a lot of intrusion into the patient cabin? I was on a car wreck recently where the patient car was hit like almost head on, and it took out basically the passenger side of the car. So when I was like assessing the patient, the patient was in the driver's seat, and I was standing where the passenger seat right beside him should have been, but instead in front of me was immediately the middle console. That's what we call a high mechanism of injury. All right. Usually with illness, that means medical problems. We're going to use nature of illness, which basically means what their medical problem was. Their level of consciousness and mental status. We'll go over a lot of this stuff, by the way. Their vital signs. It's going to include their blood pressure, their pulse, and their respiratory rates. The initial assessment you had and the ongoing assessment on the way to the hospital. Their demographics, age and sex determines a lot of times what the patient's medical problem could be. So, let's see. Things like chest pain present differently in males and females, and we'll go over that. So just those demographics can change what you think the problem is. And then the transport information. That includes things like how did we move them from where they were onto the stretcher, from the stretcher to the ambulance. Okay. And then from the stretcher to the hospital. Administrative info. When the incident was reported, the unit that was notified, when you got there, when you left, when you arrived at the hospital, when the nurse or the tech came in to actually get the report from you, and you actually transfer the care, and what time you're back in service. All these are usually times. You're going to need all these on everybody you take to the hospital. And you can see there an example of an EPCR, which is an electronic health record. Traditional written form it has check boxes, but the narrative section has to basically include everything. Even if you check the box, you need to put it in the narrative section. Okay, the reason being, for one thing, doctors and nurses read the narrative section. They don't usually look at your check boxes. The other thing is the insurance company usually doesn't look at your check boxes. All right, but this is a computerized patient care report. We use the chart method. Okay, on Moodle, there is actually a method, a tab that has the chart method in it. This is the way that we're going to have you do it when you do your clinicals. You're going to have to make a report on every patient you come in contact with. And you're going to start with basically the chief complaints. All right. Then you're going to give the history, which includes things like the history of present illness, which is basically, when did this start? What were the symptoms? What were the signs that were seen? And it includes things like the patient's previous medical history. The patient has a history of having cardiac stents, things like that. The assessment that you performed, which is usually a head-to-toe assessment that will teach you. The treatment that you gave. All right. And then how you transported and all the things that I said about the transport. How they got to the stretcher. How they got from the stretcher to the hospital, how you secured the patient to the stretcher, was there a 5-port harness, was there just seatbelts, that sort of stuff. You can always use the SOAP too. SOAP is a little harder because you have to differentiate between some subjective and objective information. So if we go back to like the chart method, which is what most people use, the patient history section has subjective information in it, which basically means it's information the patient gives you, which you can't just look and see. Like, how bad was your pain from 1 to 10? That goes in the history section because you don't know how to actually measure that. All right. Where does the patient go? Where do you feel the pain? All right. But if you see bruising, that goes in the assessment section because that is objective. Anybody can see that. These are called signs. Things that are subjective are called symptoms. So the symptoms are going to be in the subjective. The signs are going to be in the objective here. Your assessment's going to be there, and then whatever plan you actually implemented here. Or like I said, we're going to use charts. So that's the one you should actually look at. All narratives should contain time of events, whatever you found, whatever you didn't find. Okay, so these assessment findings are important for you to know. So what you found that pertains to the patient's medical or trauma problem, those are called pertinent positives, which means they were there and you expected to find them there. Now, if there are signs and symptoms that you think should be there with the patient, like chief complaint that they're reporting, and they're not there, you have to chart that as well. So if someone has chest pain, all right, something that I would expect them to actually have is going to be like pain that radiates to their left arm, which you should know about. All right, that's going to be a pertinent positive. All right, if they didn't have it, so the patient reports no radiation of that chest pain to their arm or pain anywhere, that's called a pertinent negative. And you have to chart that as well. All right, so that's going to be usually in your history section because those are subjective things. But if it's like a sign that you think they should have that should be there but isn't, that's going to be in your assessment section. So just taking chest pain again. One of the signs that I think maybe should be there or maybe not is going to be something called jugular venous distension, which basically means that vein in your neck bulges out. People that have heart attacks have that a lot of times. If that's there, I'm going to put that in the assessment. If it's not there, I'm going to write that in the assessment too. I'm going to put the patient was positive for JVD on the right and left side, or the patient was negative for JVD, so none was found. So that sort of stuff. Those are pertinent positives and pertinent negatives. So you have to know that sort of thing. I think that is going to be on your test. And then whatever you actually provided, things like we took his vital signs, his blood pressure, his heart rate, respiratory rate. We gave him oxygen, and we gave him the oxygen this way, and we gave so many liters of oxygen by this route, that sort of thing. That all has to be provided there. Whatever changes happen after the patient treatment. So let's say you go on someone who says they're having difficulty breathing, and you give that patient oxygen, and they say they feel a lot better. Okay, that needs to be charted on there. It needs to be charted in the treatment section. The patient reported improvement from their difficulty breathing after oxygen administration by such and such. Whatever you observe on scene, which includes things like how was their house kept, because that can actually tell you whether or not this patient can actually care for themselves at all. Like, was it messy? Are they a hoarder? That sort of stuff. All right. Let's say that they broke a glass and then cut their hand. The glass was there. It had so much blood on the ground. There was, such and such cc's or ml. Cc's are cubic centimeters. So many mLs of blood on the floor whenever we arrive. That sort of stuff. Those observations need to be on there. If it's a suicide attempt, and you'll run suicide attempts where someone has shot themselves in the head, if there's a gun there and the police tell you the caliber, that should be in the report. Like PD reported such and such caliber handgun was used, that sort of stuff, that has to be in there as well. Your final patient disposition, how they were when you delivered them to the hospital. If they refused care, that has to be in there. Whatever they refused, even if you transport them. Let's say you were with a paramedic or something like that, and they refuse to have an IV placed. That sort of stuff goes in the report. And then the staff person, whoever continued care. Usually I'll just write RN and that works. Health information exchanges, yeah. Improves the sharing between EMS and other healthcare providers. We don't have this a whole lot, except for actually giving them our reports. But it allows access to whatever information that's relevant. All right. And then it avoids doing things twice. It also gives you access to patient outcomes related to hospital care. So things like they can tell your EMS company how the patient did after their traffic accident. They went home yesterday, that sort of stuff. All right. And it contributes to access to this electronic health information on a regular basis. Yeah. Especially during disasters. So it's helpful there. There's not a whole lot of this in Oklahoma. Okay. So, it follows the search alert file, reconcile. So hospital and other records, it notifies the hospital incoming patients. So you can actually have, type in the patient information that you want to communicate, and then actually send them through actual written text, what sort of things is coming in. It incorporates that data into their health record and helps reconcile things with billing and quality improvement. EMSA uses something like that. Reporting errors. All right, if you leave something out of the record and don't try and cover it up, all right, you can't falsify these records. If you actually make an error on the written report while you're running it, you don't have to start all over. It's not a problem. You put one line through it and then put your initials there. That's how you need to know. That's important for you to know, because at some point you're probably going to have to use a written record, especially if the computer's breaking down and stuff. But if you falsify stuff, you're going to get fired at the minimum, basically, because we can't have that happen, because these are legal documents. All right, if you discover an error as you write, like I said, a single line, go through the error, initial it, all right, and then write the corrective information next to it. All right. If it's discovered after you submit the report, the process is the same. Now, after you submit a report, you can actually just add an addendum in there, and this includes things like, even if you forgot to put information in there that needs to be in there, you can actually make addendums to these, so long as you sign and date the addendum and make sure that it's actually on a form that shows that it's an addendum. Documenting these refusals of care. It's a common source of lawsuits, is refusal of care. I think it was in the legal section as well. So thorough documentation is critical on these. especially if you really wanted the patient to go and you really tried to get them to go and it took you 30 minutes and they still refuse. Document those things thoroughly. Any assessment findings, yeah. Any care you actually gave. Some care you can't give and have them refuse, so you got to make sure that they actually want to go to the hospital before you give it. All right, this usually applies more to paramedics, though, because we have to give medications to people sometimes and that sort of stuff. So we can't give someone a medication and then not take them to the hospital. But make sure the patient signs the form, and then have a bystander, somebody that's a family member, a police officer that's there, or someone sign as a witness. A witness doesn't mean that they agree with the patient's decision. It means that they know that the patient refused the care. All right, and then make sure you complete all your PCRs. So special reporting, yeah. We've gone over this stuff before: mass casualties, sexual assaults, dog bites, gunshots, suicide attempts, that sort of stuff. The radios and stuff, you actually have to know something about the radios in the trucks that you're actually in. But any radio and telephone links you and your team with other EMS, fire, law enforcement, or even the hospital staff. It helps you work more efficiently. All right. This was in the introduction. It provides a layer of safety and protection, especially with the radios. Even though they can have scanners and things, we actually get our own channel, so no one's interfering with us. So a base station radio. These are not mobile. All right. There's a transmitter and a receiver. All right. There's two-way radio. It has both. So, what kind of radio they are can actually allow you to interrupt communications and things, but it should be a dedicated line. A hotline is used for specific point contacts. You can actually make these sorts of hotline patches when you talk to the helicopter crew that's coming in, because you're going to want to tell them things like what sort of obstacles are going to be in their way, because it's really hard for a helicopter crew to see power lines. So it's something you have to tell them, and you can actually give them patient information over those patched hotlines. Mobile and portable radios. The mobile radio is in vehicle. All right, it's used to communicate with dispatch, medical control. You can also communicate with the hospital. Ambulances often have more than one. That's true. You're going to have portables too. Portables are handheld. All right, they're essential at mass casualties. It's also essential to keep your communication as short as possible on the radio. But it's you can be dispatched when you're in the bathroom or getting something to eat, that sort of stuff, and you can talk to medical control in another unit. A repeater is a special kind of base station radio, so not mobile stuff. So they receive the messages and signals on one frequency, and they can retransmit them on second frequency. So it allows better communication, and so kind of two mobile or portable units that can't reach each other directly, you're going to have these repeaters set up. These repeater base stations, and it helps amplify the power. So you can actually talk over longer distances. All right, telemetry allows electronic signals to be converted into coded and audible signals. All right, most radios now use this. So they can be transported by radio or telephone to a receiver with a decoder at the hospital. So there's all sorts of stuff you can actually send on this stuff. We use Bluetooth a lot now for this kind of stuff. Oh, it's actually on the slide here. Yeah, so we can transmit Bluetooth from the cardiac monitors. So if we take an EKG, which can look at the heart rhythm of the patient, I can actually send that, and the emergency physician can look at it. Especially if I think someone's having a heart attack, I'll send that. Or if there's one that's kind of different from normal, you're not going to need that kind of stuff, information for EMD, but just know that we can send all sorts of information with Bluetooth-enabled mobile devices. And those include the monitors. The monitors have Bluetooth on them. So you'll often communicate with facilities by cellular telephone. Radios are best, but if you're outside their coverage area and stuff, you'll usually use the telephone. So wherever you go to work, they will give you the telephone numbers to the emergency departments that the ambulances use to call in their reports and stuff to them. Usually, sat phones are another option. We don't use that. We don't need that. In Oklahoma, anyway. If you're going to be someone if you're going to work at a national park, you might have a sat phone because there's no actually, cell phone signal in the area and that sort of stuff. Or they may give you certain radios and things. Scanner is a radio receiver, all right, but it doesn't actually transmit things. But your conversation can be overheard, so just know that. People can actually listen to your conversation. So HIPAA does apply to the radio. But know that there's things like if there's difficulty finding an address, like they don't have their address number on their mailbox or on their door, you can have dispatch ask them what color house they're at and things like that if you need it, and not be violating HIPAA because you actually need that information to find the patient. So long as it's not like things like complaint and sex and that sort of stuff. Although they will give you that from dispatch over the radio. Ambulances usually have external public addresses. Okay, this is a loudspeaker that you can use in the ambulance. Don't abuse that. The purpose of that loudspeaker is for mass casualty incidents, so you can make an announcement to a large group of people. It's not to tell other vehicles to pull over. All right, it's not to tell them to get over to the right and that sort of stuff, or berate people. That's not what it's used for. But we do use a variety of two-way radio hardware. Yeah, Simplex, yeah, it's push to talk, release to listen. Most places actually use duplex now. Multiplex uses 2 or more frequencies. We use this for things like data transmission and things. Med channels are reserved for EMS use. There used to be old push to talk, I think they were Nextels, that actually interfered with EMS use. That all went away after 9/11. So after, September 11, 2001, where communication was such a big factor in that, we got our own channels for EMS use, and we can actually talk to fire and police and so on. Trunking systems assign many frequencies. If there is a problem with this tower, you're going to have a trunk. It's a TRUNK will flash over the radio and it'll start beeping, and you won't be able to send anything on these trunking systems. But they're very helpful when they work, and they work most of the time. If they're working on them or something, there could be a problem. But you might have to use your cellular phone or something else to actually communicate with that. But it can actually assign many frequencies so that they can all use the same power. It's a communication system. Like I said, it allows all the agencies to share information with each other. Now, there are also mobile data terminals inside the ambulance where you can receive actual information. So we usually call this the CAD. It's a computerized assisted dispatch. So we can have all sorts of dispatch information actually come over that. We can look up previous calls that the addresses had and actually get dispatch information over that. But we receive that data straight from the dispatch center. And it's usually enhanced 911 systems, those systems that can actually give you things like their previous calls and their location. So the FCC regulates all radio operations in the U.S., which means that if you use profanity over radio, the FCC can fine you. Even though it's over in the EMS radio. So don't do that. It's also unprofessional. But it allocates the actual frequencies and licenses all call signs. Okay. So there are licensing standards, and it monitors radio operations, like I said. The dispatch are very important people. This is a very old dispatch here that they used the picture for. They're way better now. But the dispatcher receives and gives the call to the 911 system. They're very helpful. Some of these people are EMD trained emergency medical dispatcher. Like I said, these people take months and months to actually learn this stuff, and they can actually give CPR information or Heimlich information over the phone. They assign everything too, by the way. They select the dispatch, which unit they need to go. All right. They coordinate with all the public safety system between EMS and fire and police and record services too sometimes. And they provide instructions to the caller. Sometimes they can't because they're not EMDs, but most of your big cities are going to have EMDs there. So your EMT report. So responding to the scene, report any problems that took place on the run. So if someone runs into you and you have an accident, you have to report that contact so they can dispatch another ambulance. These sorts of things are obvious. If there's a train in the way and you can't get to the patient, that's something you got to report to dispatch. Right? You also have to tell them when you're actually on scene. This is for your safety too. So they know you're on scene. Sometimes you'll get a wrong address and it's actually across the street. You need to report that too. So if there's actually a safety problem, the police know which address to go to. So communicating with medical control. The principal reason for radio communication is to facilitate communication between you and medical control. That's true. You can talk to the hospitals on the radio. You can talk to your own medical control. It may be located at the receiving hospital or another facility. It may just be, on the phone to your actual, director, if you have their number. I think everybody at IMSA has Dr. Goodlow's number. I have my medical director's number. It serves several purposes, okay? It notifies the hospital that you're coming there. They're really going to appreciate that. And if you don't do that, there's going to be a problem. It also, lets you request advice or things like giving breathing treatments to the patient, that sort of stuff. You have to. Sometimes you have to call in for medical control for certain medications or treatments you give, even as an EMT. So it usually includes at least 10 elements. So who you are, what service you're with, so your unit that's coming in, any special alerts indicated by the patient condition. These are alerts are things like heart attacks, which we would call a STEMI alerts, stroke alerts, the level 1 traumas, that sort of stuff. These are alerts that they need to know because those are really time-sensitive patients. Sepsis alerts are another one, and you'll learn all the conditions for these as you work through your actual service. We can actually give you some here while we're doing scenarios 2 in the lab. It gives them your estimated time of arrival. ETA technically isn't like ETA 10 minutes because that's not time. It'll be ETA 1000. That would be an ETA technically. But you also have to tell your patient age and gender and then their chief complaint. A brief history of the patient's problem. They did this and that. A brief report of their physical findings that you find. Anything that's positive that they need to know. So if, they were in a car wreck and they have a fracture to their, angulated femur, you need to tell them that. Brief summary of what you did. All right. And a brief description of the response to the treatment. They're doing better. Their mental status improved, that sort of stuff. And I'll always end with, do you have any further questions? Usually it's no. We've gone over medical control before. Like I said, it's certain treatments. If you need to call them and ask for that, or if you need some sort of advice for some reason, you can always call and ask for that. And then if you want to stop the treatment or not transport a patient, that's always going to be medical control because that's a legal and medical issue. Usually they'll never allow you to stop a treatment or not transport a patient. Yeah, so in most cases, you'll be talking to the receiving physician. All right, so there are some variations of that. Individual physician would be usually your medical director. There's freestanding centers technically you can call. One of the places, like I said, that can actually give you medical control is the Poison Control Center. They can actually tell you if you need to give activated charcoal, which is something that kind of binds whatever poison they take or medication to the patient. But activated charcoal only works on certain medications, and they're the experts in that kind of stuff. So I always like to give them a heads up on that thing so I can see what to expect and what kind of treatment I should give. So the dispatcher can monitor and assign appropriate medical control channels. You might contact the dispatcher to have them pass you through to medical control, and there are centralized dispatch and coordination centers for that sort of stuff. The man in the funny hat is probably a doctor. Anytime someone's in green scrubs, it's usually a surgeon here, but this is probably an emergency medical physician because he's sitting there looking at heart monitors. But be precise when calling. Deliver all the important information. All right. Never use codes. All right. Unless it's in your actual protocol, because it might be different between the hospital and then the ambulance. So it's just going to eat up time. It's very important that you know whatever order the medical control gives you, you repeat verbatim, word for word, back that order to whoever the physician or the medical control people that gave it to you to make sure that it's clear what you're going to do. All right. Don't blindly follow an order that doesn't make sense to you. Repeat it back. All right. And so you repeat it back and make sure whatever you're unclear about, you get it and you ask them about it. So you may initiate communication with hospitals and advise them of extraordinary situations. You always have a handoff report and things like that. But you call the hospital for extraordinary stuff, hazmat scenes, mass casualties, that sort of stuff. Several points to keep in mind. The earlier the better. Give them an estimated number of the patients and identify any special needs, things like language barriers. This patient is visually impaired, they're hearing impaired, that sort of stuff. Follow your plans. So, like any other thing, the radio has to be serviced. You should check your radio at the start of the shift. All your radio equipment may fail during the run, so have a backup plan. Usually it's going to be a personal cell phone, but it's whatever is actually in your protocols. Okay, quickly, let's do this review. All right. When healthcare providers force their cultural values, so forcing your cultural values onto a patient because they believe it's better. So what are they explaining? So I can see there's pretty much two things on here that we actually discussed that pertain to this. So it's either going to be A or D. All right. So this is knowing the actual definition of this word. It's D. All right. So cultural imposition, forcing your values onto someone else. All right. So it's important that the other choice A, you need to know what that is. It's considering your own culture as more, your own cultural values is more important, but actually imposition is actually forcing your values onto others. All right. When communicating with older patients, you should approach the patient slowly and calmly. Yeah, that seems true. Step back to avoid making the patient feel uncomfortable. Maybe not. Raise your voice. Yeah, no, because a lot of elderly patients actually can hear quite well. Obtain the majority of information from family members. Don't exclude patients when they can actually answer you. It's obviously all right, so while caring for a 5-year-old with respiratory distress, you should what? Avoid eye contact, as this may frighten him? Not really. Avoid letting the child hold any toys? Nah. They can go ahead and hold toys if it doesn't hinder your care. All right, just because it may hinder it doesn't mean you have to do it. So maybe let's see what else. Avoid alerting the child prior to a patient procedure. No, you should always tell them that. Allow a parent or caregiver to hold the child if the situation allows. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so it's D. Let them hold the child. If they can hold the child, it's going to calm them down. If the parent's calm, definitely let them hold the child if they can. All right, which of the following pieces of information is of least pertinence when giving a verbal report to a nurse or a physician in the hospital? Patient's name and age, that's important. The medical history, the family medical history, the vital signs that may have changed, or the medication that the patient's taking. It's usually going to be B. Let's see what it is. Yeah, it's B. That's the least important. Not saying it's not important. It's just the least important. Which of the following statements about PCR is true? So it's not a legal document. It is a legal document. It cannot be used for billing patient information. That's what you use for billing patient information. It helps ensure continuity of patient care. Well, yeah. C looks great. What's D, though? We got to make sure that D isn't a better answer. It's intended for use only by the pre-hospital care provider. No, you actually hand that over to the hospital. And so it's obviously C. So a device that receives low frequency signal then transmitted at a higher frequency is what? All right, so this is a definition, so you actually need to know it. So is a duplex scanner repeater receiver. So one of these actually transmits these low frequency signals and makes it at a higher, and it's actually C. Yeah, it's the repeater that actually amplifies whatever signal we get. So it'll amplify things like your portable radios. All right, when treating a potential hostile patient, you should try to diffuse the situation by what? You don't want an aggressive posture. It doesn't diffuse the hostile situation to stare at the patient. Speaking calmly, confidently, slowly, yeah, that seems right. Verbally threatening the patient is never going to be correct. So let's see. All right, when treating a potentially hostile patient, you should try to avoid diffuse the situation. Here's your answers. Read over them carefully so you know. All right, all the following are functions of the emergency medical dispatch except one. So they do alert the appropriate EMS response unit. They actually can screen the call and assign it a priority. That happens in bigger systems a lot. They can provide medical instructions, providing medical direction to the EMT in the field. They don't do that. So it's deep. So make sure in these sorts of questions that you read the question carefully and notice these words like accept, All right, after receiving an order from medical control over the radio, what should you do? Okay, so I'm going to tell you that these kind of questions are really common. So it should be D. Yeah, it's D. Repeat it back word for word, verbatim. All right, when requesting medical direction for a patient who was involved in a major car accident, you should avoid what? Using radio codes, questioning an order that seems inappropriate. You should question those orders. Relating vital signs left there are normal. No, you should tell them vital signs, even if they're normal. That way they know they have normal vital signs. They're always going to need vital signs in radio reports and things. The use of medical terminology when speaking. All right, so what do you think? Yeah, it's A. So it says on here, when given a report to medical control requesting medical direction, you should avoid using codes like 1050 or Signal 70. These are TIN codes. We should never use those. We speak in common language now.